Hey, about to go out and shoot with another YouTube photography channel guy. We're going to go to the Edison Ford Winter Estates. I had a thought when I reviewed the Viltrox 85mm last week, and I realized that I'd not made a video on this topic, and that is that everybody thinks about dynamic range of a camera. There actually is, and I know for certain that there's no other YouTube photography channel that's mentioned this, including myself up to this point, that lenses themselves actually have a dynamic range. And superficially, one might not consider that a possibility, but it is the case, and this is where coatings are actually very important. And some of my most favorite lenses are some really old lenses that are completely uncoated, but it's not an issue unless you're shooting into the sun, and they are very low element count lenses, usually 6 elements or less, but they actually render incredibly well. Either that or they have extremely weak AR coating, and AR coating is a crystalline growth deposit on the actual surface of the lens, but it actually cuts down on inner element lens bounce. But when you actually have a high dynamic scene, it is the case that a lens actually, no matter what the dynamic range of the camera is, has itself a dynamic range. When you're shooting specular highlights, when you want to specifically also shoot ETTR, exposing to the right, or what I call specifically sensor saturation, and I showed you examples of that, they're up on my Flickr page, on this specific Viltrox, and it's just one example among many, that it actually has less of a dynamic range. You can actually compensate for this. What you actually have to do is cut the light at the front of the lens, not at the rear of the exposure, which is exactly what someone's going to leave in a comment below if I didn't mention this fact. People say, well, you know, if a lens has less dynamic range and the highlights are blooming or smearing, specifically one perfect example is where I was shooting a scene, and there was some white lettering on a mailbox, very bright white, and the white was just smearing into the red. And this has to do with the lens coating on this specific lens. So this lens actually has less dynamic range than, say, an 85mm 1.8G Nikkor, for example. So a lens actually does have a dynamic range. You can actually, of course, fix up a lot of this stuff in Lightroom and Photoshop, but the question is, do you really want to? The way you can actually solve for that is cutting the light before it hits the front element. Doesn't necessarily occur at the front element, of course. It actually occurs in inner element lens bounce with a 2-stop or 3-stop ND filter. Because the smear has already occurred, if you actually think, well, I'm going to compensate for that, and I did shots where I did 2 stops under, 2 stops over, and correct exposure, it still doesn't make any difference, because when you're actually cutting the exposure on the camera via shutter speed, or actually stopping down at the aperture, and the aperture is the rear of the lens, doesn't make any difference, because the smear has already occurred, which I like to call it smear. You can actually call it highlight bleed. It goes by a dozen different names. I don't give a damn what you call it. But lenses do have a dynamic range. When you're talking about 6, 10, 12, and this is a 10-element lens, you're talking about multiple element lenses, and specifically zooms, which most lenses are today. Having a superior coatings on the lenses for inner element lens bounce and to keep the highlights from smearing or blooming into surrounding areas is important. And I should have made this video quite some time ago, but a lens actually does have a dynamic range. And this is mostly due, it's not entirely due, but it's mostly due to inner element light bounce due to coatings, but it is also due to the additive elements that are included in the glass. Zeiss still uses lead. There's actually an exemption for lead in optical instruments in Europe. Like, we don't use lead in consumer products anymore. There's actually an exemption for lead. It actually changes the refractive index and the dielectric permittivity of the glass. Glass is not simply an insulator, it's also a capacitor. Nikon and Fujifilm and Canon and others actually use niobium oxide, lanthanum dioxide. These are added into the glass, same way they used radioactive thorium to change the refractive index and actually cut down on the thickness of the glass back in the day. I mean, no one on YouTube has ever asked the question, why did they stick radioactive crap in the glass? It's not a coating, it's actually in the glass. The glass itself was doped with kind of like sticking sugar in a cake. You're doping the cake with more sugar. You actually add the radioactive thorium into the molten glass before it is actually cast or molded or ground and so on and so forth, and polished ultimately, of course. But yes, this is not my opinion or a theory or some sort of harebrained idea. Lenses do have a dynamic range if they don't have really good inner element lens coatings. And that's one minor issue, and that's the one fault, for example, that I pointed out on this Viltrox, but there are many such examples of lenses that have this issue. So yes, it's not simply cameras that have dynamic range issues or lack thereof. It's also the case that is applicable to and for lenses. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you like these videos, you always click the link below, make a small donation, because I don't sell anything. My books are for free, and I don't have any affiliate links. I'm not pimping and shilling anything, unlike absolutely everybody else on YouTube is doing, and I do mean everybody. Thanks so much for watching. Peace out, Girl Scout.